just want to say thank you very much for coming out on what doesn't feel like the record-breaking January, the hottest on record. So thank you for that. This always seems like a good place to start for me. I don't know if any of you have seen these before. It's called Climate Stripes, and it was put together by a really talented guy. I think this was at Reading University, called Ed Hawkins. And each line, each stripe is a year since the Industrial Revolution, since fossil fuels and consequently carbon emissions really started to sort of take off. And so what you can see here on a global level is it's progressively getting warmer. I mean, it doesn't need that much explanation. There is always going to be some variation. There are going to be some hotter years and some colder years. But the really scary thing is that we're moving into such a deep shade of red that I don't know if it exists. So it's, we're getting into whatever a sort of black red would be called. So the next one I wanted to show, because this is at a UK level, and it does show a lot more variation, and on the global level, you can see it's really, if we go back quickly, it's very clear it's getting warmer. In terms of the UK, it's less clear. We've had some hot years. You possibly remember 1976 and remember 2003 and 2018. We will have these very hot years. But again, it's about trends. The general trend is it's getting warmer. But I think, in a sense, this sort of draws that distinction between, when you hear it's the hottest year ever, and then you look out the window. Looking out the window is weather. That's not climate change. But even in the UK, there's going to be variations. So it's really important to remember that. And actually, we can get even closer. Brighton is the closest we can get there. And again, you will see even more variation sort of locally. But actually, being in the southeast, it's going to be different to the northeast. So it will be showing hotter, drier. And then just touching on that, I think it was yesterday, wasn't it, when they announced that January was the hottest January on record. And the reason why that is really important is 23 and 24 have been the hottest on year. But we've also had an El Nino year, so that amplifies and exaggerates the sort of warming trend. But El Nino is slackening off now, and so there is quite a bit of surprise amongst climate scientists that we're still sort of on that upward trend. The amazing thing now is all the satellites that we have, and Copernicus is one of those sort of weather satellite systems. So they can show with great accuracy and sort of at really sort of granular level sometimes what is going on. But that does mean that it takes a while to sort of put that in terms of trends. So we will possibly be clearer on what this means, in 6 months or a year's time. But it is interesting that this has happened, and you can see here the difference between 2023 and 2024, and it's 24 was very warm.
There two graphs there, two lines.
So the orange line is what was going on in 2023 over the year, and the red is 2024, and this just shows, if you compare 23. January to 24 January to 25 January, and these are in El Nino, and El Nino is slackening off. That's really quite surprising. And in fact, if you go to other parts of the world, and if you go to the Arctic, it is even more extreme, and that is the terrifying thing. Sorry, I wasn't going to use that word, but looking at 20 degrees above normal in the Arctic is quite worrying, and we'll sort of get on to that a little bit as to why that is important. So, you know, it's 1.75 degrees at the moment above normal. And just to give you sort of an overall picture of, and sorry, this just goes up to September, in 2024, you know, that shows what was going on around the world, where some of those kind of really, really hot spots were. And, you know, I do climate training, a lot of training in here, not in this room, but in another room. And 2023, I was using last year, and this is, it's quite hard to keep up with it, actually. We're getting the apocalyptic stuff out of the way first. But, you know, this is just in the last, I think, 4 or 5 months. And as I say, it's quite difficult to keep up with it. I do remember used to roll out these climate projections, you know, which were, so the projections were done by the Hadley Centre, and they basically said, you know, this is, in fact, we'll have a bit of a look at that. But it sort of said this is what's going to happen in 2020, 2050, 2080. And actually trying to find extreme weather events. You know, you had to do a little bit of trawling around research. Now it's just trying to keep up with it. The pace of it is quite phenomenal. So, you know, this was, I think this was Storm Bert, just around December. You know, in Wales there was a lot of flooding. This, as I'm sure you know, is Valencia. And I don't know if anybody's seen that footage, but there's a bit of footage where it just starts with a little trickle and it's some mud, and there's a policeman sort of looking at it going, what's that? And then within about 30 seconds, he's having to drive off really rapidly and then there's another car floating past. So these things are happening. I mean, this is kind of a bit Hollywood territory. And I think the difference is that these things are really close to home, and you know, you're going in some countries, you're going from really, you're going through these extremes from very hot, dry summers to very wet, intense weather events in the winter. So that's, as you know, in Hollywood recently, the fires. And that, I think, was Storm Helena that went through the Caribbean. What you can do now, which was very different in the past, is you can attribute different weather events, extreme weather events, to climate change, or not. So it's called attribution studies, and there is the World Attribution Service, I think that's the right name, and these, you know, this is a bunch of climate scientists who are around the world who are networked up, and they can work very quickly on extreme weather events, so know within a few weeks whether or not it is likely that will have been caused by human-induced climate change. And actually, you know, sometimes, as in quite a few of the Canadian wildfires, and in Los Angeles as well, some of them aren't necessarily caused by climate change, but it's caused by conditions, by the fact that it is hotter and drier. You know, sometimes it will be other things that will have started that. It might be, you know, it might be arson. You know, it could be a number of things, but it's just the conditions mean that it's more likely to have a bigger impact. And then, you know, very recently here, you know, we had our very rare but red weather warnings. So with Storm Erwin recently that hit Northern Ireland and Edinburgh, Scotland with severity. And what you're starting to get now, and they had in Valencia, was, you know, with technology, with phones, people's phones, you know, they're alerted now. Whether you like it or not, you can be alerted to an extreme weather event. So it will become increasingly commonplace. And just around the world, I suppose to put it in some human terms, and again, you know, these are extreme weather events that can be said with absolute certainty to be attributed to human-induced climate change. You know, it shows the types of extreme weather events and the human cost. You know, let alone the cost on wildlife and nature and buildings and transport and economies and everything you can possibly think of. So a lot of cyclones, a lot of heavy storms and droughts. And, you know, and you will have, I'm sure you will have noticed with winters now, when it rains harder. You know, it's more intense. And one of the things about a warming world and a warm environment is that it holds more moisture. So that when it does rain, it rains with force. And I think at the same time, it's really important to recognise that there are other, you know, it's a bigger context. These are the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate action is part of that. There is some issue with these goals, like decent work and economic growth. I mean, that's quite an interesting one at the moment, given the political agenda around growth, whether prosperity might be a better thing. But, you know, health and well-being, education, you know, affordable energy, clean energy, water pollution, these are really important issues as well. And climate can exacerbate some of those issues, but we have to remember that, you know, cost of living crisis is very real. So when we're talking about climate change and when we're trying to respond to that, we have to remember the other pressures that we're dealing with as well. Some of which will impact on those issues, but some are completely separate. And I think the other thing that is important to remember as well is the sort of causes of climate change, you know, and the mitigation. So that will be things about reducing carbon, reducing greenhouse gases, and the impacts, how we deal with those impacts, how we adapt to them. And all too often, especially in political rhetoric, but in policy, in the way that we talk about these things, those can be separated out. And it's really frustrating to me, having worked in this area for so long, that we are actually further behind on adaptation and resilience than we were, I feel, sort of 15 years ago. We used to have these, it was a government thing. We had these national performance indicators. As local authorities, we had one called 188 that was all about preparing for climate change and adapting to climate change. In the 2008 recession, they were all dumped. And that is a real shame, because that's put us back so far. And the thing about greenhouse gases and carbon emissions is that a lot of it's locked in. There's stuff that we can't do. Even if we reduce all our emissions to zero today, there are emissions locked in. So we're going to have to deal with those consequences. So we have to prepare. But they're not, you know, they're not exclusive. It's not all about net zero or all about adaptation. You know, both are sort of equally important and need to be bundled up. I'm sure I don't need to go through what the greenhouse gas effect is. I know this is kind of builder's science, but I'm not going to be entirely. I'm not a scientist. It's all about the context. But the important thing is that carbon dioxide emissions, which is the main greenhouse gas, just because of its abundance and the fact that it does last a long time, you know, up to 100 years in the atmosphere. And although there is a lot of data here, and there are some graphs, because I felt a duty, as Julia build this as a science thing, I felt a duty to do that, and I do use graphs and stuff in training, but we shouldn't get bogged down in the data. You know, there are some key things to remember, but we don't need to know every single thing. The key thing about this is that carbon emissions were at a pretty consistent level. And then it is absolutely clear since 1850, since the Industrial Revolution, that they have just risen at a really worrying pace. So for 10,000 years, say up 280 parts per million, you know, that was about the level. And currently I think we're at 422.1, so they rise at about 3 parts per million per year. And this is measured by, there's a place called Manalawa in Hawaii, where there's an observatory there, and that's very clear atmosphere. So there are no sort of variables there that have to be taken into account. They've been measuring carbon dioxide emissions accurately since the 50s. Can't remember exactly when, but sometime in the 50s. So that's where that data comes from, and there will always be releases of CO2. There's always natural releases of greenhouse gases, but which explains that figure. But it's really when fossil fuel profligate use of fossil fuels kicked in that rose. And we had a record rise last year, in fact, which, with all our net zero policies, is a little bit concerning. And as I say, 800,000 years ago, there's I think there's 3 main studies that get used. There's one that goes further back than this. This is the sort of the mid-range, so this is the one I tend to use. It takes that mid-figure going back to 800,000 years, and you'll see that there will be peaks and troughs over time. It rises and falls, but essentially, we are in uncharted territory. And the important thing is that every bit of avoided warming really matters. So 0.1 of a degree, if we can reduce it by that is really, really important. And I think when you get above 1.5 degrees, I think, as I understand it, there's like a near linear relationship between temperature and CO2 emissions. So that those rises, if we don't get a handle, they will become even sharper. So just in terms of, because I know carbon dioxide gets talked about all the time, but there are other greenhouse gases that we do have to be concerned about. So methane is one of those, and obviously a lot of methane is cow burps and cow farts. So there are discussions there about diets and where we get our food from, and obviously what we do in terms of our waste. We produce a huge amount of waste, recycling, and whether that is burnt, a lot of methane comes off still from landfills. Probably less so in this country now, but certainly around the world there is a lot of methane. And also at the same time, I suppose that in terms of those diets, in terms of agriculture, most of the soya is for animal feed and is for cows and cattle. And a lot of that soya is grown where forests are cleared. So, you have these sort of double whammies going on, or triple whammies even, where, forests that are so important in sequestering and storing that carbon are cut down to produce soya for animal feed that then produce the methane. We've got some really bad circles going on. Nitrous oxide is a really powerful one as well. So in terms of agriculture, and I think it's like 350 times more powerful than CO2. Obviously, as I say, the percentage of carbon is by far the bigger, so that's the one we sort of worry about. But if the proportion of those other greenhouse gases start to sort of creep up, then again, that's slightly worrying. I mean, even something like water vapor, from airplanes, that is a greenhouse gas, and it's a very, very potent greenhouse gas, but it's not around very long. But more flights, more water vapor, etc., that can have a big impact. So in terms of what a ton of carbon looks like, it's bigger than a 3-bedroom semi. And if you think that each person is probably around about 10 to 12 tons of carbon, on average you think like 3 people, 4 people in that house, you start to get an idea just visually of what all that carbon looks like. And then at the other end of the scale, in terms of what does a kilogram of carbon dioxide gets you, well, sorry, it's in kilometres. This is from a great book called Carbon Almanac, but it's quite American. So yeah, it gets you 10 average size apples, cycling 48 kilometres or 8 kilometres in a car. Interestingly, if cycling an electric bike actually uses less carbon, and that because it takes into account you as the machine and what you eat and the amount of energy as well. So actually, electric bikes use less carbon, which is good for me. And it shows you, and compared to walking, so actually cycling will use less carbon than walking, which is kind of quite counterintuitive. We do a lot of carbon rankings, so there's another. I'm going to recommend some books. So How Bad is Bananas is a brilliant book because. So one of the important things. So going slightly off topic, but I think it's really important to, in the way that you think about your household finances, and you think about, and we do, especially in the cost of living crisis, you have to make choices. You have to do the same with carbon. And I was one of those quite a few years ago who was proposing that we have carbon budgets and that was before we had the technology. That was before we had all these smart cards and loyalty cards. We could do it so easily now. And it would be equitable that everybody has their carbon budget that is in line with what we need to do to reach our net zero targets. And it means that if you're not using it, then you can sell that to somebody else that does want to sort of fly twice a year or whatever. But if we're serious, that's what we need to do. We don't do it because politically nobody wants to be the one to say that. And I remember, won't name them, but their head of climate sustainability at Brighton said, "You can't do that. That would just mean that we're on a war footing and that this is a war." And it's, yes, yeah, we absolutely are. So, I kind of think we need to think seriously about that. And the other thing to say is that this is not new. I mean, none of this is new. And I do feel like old Father Time a bit. I vaguely remember when I was young and this was all exciting. And it's still, still feel like we're saying the same things. But, the greenhouse gas effect was demonstrated in the 1890s, I think. And it's been known about, so this article from 1956 in the New York Times said, the warmer climate on Earth may be down to more carbon dioxide in the air. It was recognised. In 65, the president, not the current president, said, that the increase in carbon dioxide will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. George Bush Sr., do you remember the Kyoto Protocol? Margaret Thatcher was a great, she arguably did the most for climate change, not socially and community-wise. She probably didn't do that much, but actually in terms of reducing reliance on fossil fuels, she did quite a lot. And George Bush Sr., I remember him saying with the Kyoto Protocol, it's like, yes, climate change is really important, but the American lifestyle is not up for grabs. I mean, that just stuck in my head. And that illustrates the tensions there. And I suppose, in terms of the evidence and the confidence, we have the International Panel on Climate Change, which is, it's a couple of thousand of experts, I think, that review that. But each report, which I think is every 5 years, has got more confident. So it's, the word that's used is unequivocal. And I do remember when the reports first started, and 90% was a figure that was sort of bandied around, whereas now it's certain, it's 100%. There's no argument at all. And sort of mentioned the greenhouse gas effect being demonstrated in the 1890s. I mean, the links between, the physical processes, that everybody agrees with that. Measuring CO2, I mentioned sort of Manilao, the observatory, but the really, really critical thing is around satellites and is around weather modelling data, supercomputers, the way that computers are networked now around the world. The processing power, the accuracy is just quite incredible. Probably more accurate than being able to predict whether it's going to rain tomorrow, in some cases, because over time they can see these trends. Natural factors. So what gets thrown out a lot is solar flares. Mentioned El Nino. There are these things that sometimes will exacerbate the impacts. They, when a report is produced, when the IPCC produced their report, all those natural variations are factored in, and I mentioned about the computer modelling. So I suppose what I'm saying there is, yes, you can argue against the evidence, you can. I mean, I can tell you that it's 90 degrees outside right now. It's gorgeous. Because that's what you're doing. It is the evidence and the confidence is there. So, one of the other big causes of carbon emissions is deforestation. So there is a great little, I think it only goes up to 2021, but on YouTube it shows since, I think it's since 1850, the way that countries have changed and their ranking in terms of sort of carbon emissions, and it's quite fascinating to watch. And one of the key things is that the United States has always been there. It's only relatively recently that China has kind of come up. And China and Japan have sort of switched around in some senses, but the US has always been up there because it's always been a very capitalist, high-consuming society. You will get some countries like China. There's a lot of solar farms. There's a lot of wind turbines, and they produce a lot of those. But it's just the scale. It's the absolute scale. So there's still a lot of coal manufacturing. And I just thought this is a very interesting tool. And I use this quite a lot, actually. It's called the Impact Tool. It was produced by the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And what it does is it takes... we have a national inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. It's always a 2-year time lag, and it mainly looks at stuff from transport, industry, and buildings. And local authority, others will use that inventory to kind of set a baseline for emissions. So because it will go into local authority areas, and this has turned that into a really nice tool. And you can look at parishes, you can look at ward areas, you can look at local authority unitary areas. So I just thought it'd be quite interesting to look at the difference between a few. So Brighton and Hove, you think. And you can also do it by territory, or you can do it by consumption emissions. So I like to include the consumption one because, as I said, a lot is offshored, and this includes your indirect emissions, so stuff that you buy and services that you use. And you can see that is a huge part of the footprint, so 4.23 tonnes. But something like, if you keep your eye on travel, so the blue one, Brighton's got a really good public transport system. It's fairly easy to sort of get around. So we go moving on to Lewes. This is Lewes's footprint. You'll see the travel sort of crept up a bit. Also the housing, so the housing there, which is the red one here, that's 2.25 tonnes. So this is per household. Whereas in Brighton it's 2.58. Sorry, in Lewes it's 2.58. So that will be because there's probably more flats. It's probably slightly more efficient housing. I mean, they do obviously have solid walls and listed buildings, all the rest of it. But there's probably less of that in Brighton than there is in Lewes. And then if you move to Rodmell, you will see that the housing it really jumps up. So that will include all your your fuel use, your gas, electricity, the kind of building. So exactly that. So it'd be oil, it'd be solid walls. The travel will be much more as well because you haven't got the sort of public transport. Then your services will go up. So where you live, it makes a huge difference to the amount of carbon that you're producing. And then this again is another useful illustration of where we are and basically how off target we are. So this is produced by Climate Action Tracker. I think they update it annually. So this was in the end of last year's, the latest one. We are above 1.5 currently, and that was the goal. That was the Paris goal, the aspiration. Even with all those determined contributions, they were only ever going to get to 2.1. So 1.5, even at the time, was quite a big ask. We're so off target. So the real world, based on the current policies that we have now, and bearing in mind, please bear in mind for a second that this was November 2024, which is a very different world to February 2025. When you think of what's happened since then. I'll just let that sink in, because even with the real world action there, we were looking at as the most likely outcome 2.7 degrees, potentially to 3.4, or the very best to 2.2. So I know, sort of. I mean, we're 1.2 higher at the moment than we were in the pre-industrial area. And although that doesn't sound very much, it has had dramatic impacts on the loss of ice and heat waves and acidification, etc. And just to kind of set that out in another form, it kind of shows that sort of progress of where I think it's interesting to see the gap between where we need to be and where we're likely to be by 2100. So that is quite a big gap when you look at it like that. It's not possible to get to 1.5. I will tell you that now. It's not possible. And I think this is really important for me, is just to put it into some context of what the difference half a degree makes, so the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So sea level rise of sort of 0.1 metre higher may not sound like a lot, but when you think of cities, the low-lying, some of the big cities around the world, including London, it puts 10 million more people at risk. Extreme hot days, 2.5 times more likely. Coral reefs, more than 90% lost. I mean, it is fairly well believed that we have lost all our coral, that the coral is going. Twice the number of plants and vertebrates exposed to climate risk. And the big injustices of climate change is that the more vulnerable you are, the more likelihood that you're going to suffer the impacts of climate change more, because you'll be living in sort of more marginalised conditions, places where you're more exposed to some of those climate impacts. You just don't have that resilience, and several hundred million more people exposed to climate risk and poverty. Crop yields and fishing declining by half. So that's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And we're talking about potentially towards 3 degrees, 2.5 to 3 degrees. So it will be a different world. This is an evolving slide. I had this slide at one point. This slide used to be fairly euphoric. That's why I've left that in there, just to remind myself that hope is still there. So it used to be, everybody's aligned. We're going to get to 1.5. Well, as you know, I'm sure the US have pulled out of the Paris Agreement. COP since there was so many hopes for the Glasgow COP, where we thought following Paris, things were moving in the right direction. Since then, the COP has really not achieved anything. I think it's addressed issues of reparations for some of those countries that are more exposed to climate change measures, but there is no unity there. 1.5 ... sails into the horizon, and that. So on one side of the Atlantic, there is a drill baby drill era, and on the other side, we have this growth agenda. Now, there is nothing wrong with growth, and growth and net zero should not be incompatible. I heard what sounded to me like a slightly desperate Ed Miliband yesterday, saying much the same thing. But it is very surprising to me the way that they have started to sort of separate a little bit, and that if we've got any chance of staying close to 2 degrees, that can't happen. One of the huge success stories has been renewable energy. I am old enough to remember a time when people were saying there is no way that wind could contribute to that, and now you can see quite often that wind will be the biggest part of the energy mix. So what this shows again is just those global surface temperatures, the way that we're sort of going up. So there's always peaks, but the trend is up, up, up. And I wanted to put this in because this is from a climate change thing that I was doing. I think this was like 2004, and these were part of the projections they had at the time from the Tyndall Centre used to produce them. And what it shows here is sort of average that was expected. And if we take, so take the 2050s, this green line, we were talking about sort of 2 degrees there in the 2050s on a low emission scenario, and a high emission scenario. We were talking between sort of 2.5 and 3. And it's just, the reason I wanted to kind of put that in there was because I think it's pretty much on the money. If you go back to climate projections and what we were to expect, it's pretty close. The pace has really picked up and started to pick up now, and that is, just get to that. But actually today, and I think that's why it's really frustrating that we're not better prepared, because I feel like, I'm confident that what they say. So I'm not going to go through all this but it's just the science thing. You said bring some science, but it was just to sort of say really that what we expected by mid-century was that 2018 summer, if you can remember that there's that's sort of twice as likely. Rainfall is dropping. Average rainfall is increasing in the winter. Heavy rainfall, as is spoken about, that's increasing. These are all things that but this shows it really well. This again is Ed Hawkins has done a similar thing with rainfall. So this shows the trend, winter rainfall, and as I'm sure you know that. Last winter was the wettest winter on record. So unfortunately this went to 2023, so it doesn't actually show that. So there will be one that goes right up there. But it does show that sort of that trend. But this is the key thing. So this is day one. Day one, younger me, sort of had a bit more hair on the top here. So the thing is, it's hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, more intense and frequent storms. That is all you need to know. That is the key thing, and that is what's happening. And knowing that, that's how you think about your land use, you think about your policies, you think about your actions, you think about how it affects society, you think about the risk, how vulnerable you are, how vulnerable you are as a community, as a building, what is the likelihood of exposure to that event, what kinds of events they might be, storms. So you've got those impacts map there, and that's why that's so important, because we can see these things happening. We can see flint walls that are more likely to fall down. We live in a beautiful town and beautiful heritage, but extremely exposed. I used to do a lot with insulation, and for about 10 years, never one complaint about cavity wall insulation. Suddenly they started coming in. That was to do with intense rainfall and a lack of sort of good rendering and pointing, and the rain as parallel could get in. That's a really mundane example of the sorts of things that we have to deal with. I hope you can kind of read that, and sorry, it's not the most exciting slide, but it is really important. Every 5 years, the government do the climate change risk assessment, the UK climate risk assessment. So we've just had our third one, and they outline risks. So I think there's like 65 risks on there, the key ones they've identified. This is the top 8, and the top 4 of those top 8 are all focused around biodiversity and nature. So if you think about our landscapes, our habitats, our chalk downland, our rivers, our water, there's all sorts of climate impacts there, whether it's increasing invasive species, whether it's sort of drought or storm. So there's huge risks there. Soil health. So soil is pretty much the most important thing in the world. And what you will see is that there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere, the flora and fauna combined. So looking after your soil health is the most important thing. And actually so flooding, for instance, you'll see it on the Somerset levels, you see it around here actually on the Lewes Brooks area. If you are driving a big tractor and you are crushing that soil, when it rains, when you get this more intense rainfall, it will stay there. It won't move, apart from sort of actually impacting on the ability of that soil to sequester carbon. So looking after your soil is really, really important. Then there's all those other carbon stores, forests and trees. We've had our storms recently. I think a couple of years ago in Scotland, big storms, brought down loads of trees, brought down loads of power lines, power cables. People were off electricity for up to a month, I think, in some cases. So big impacts there to forests and our livestock and commercial trees, crops. Our food system is complicated, much more complicated than it needs to be, so that everything has kind of been globalized to some extent. So when we're looking at local food, there are lots of risks there from climate change. So again, this is where we have to think about how we farm and how we grow food. And then the other things are, I mentioned the supply of food and goods. So with our supply chains, and we've had experience of this in the pandemic. You've seen what happened with our just-in-time approaches now. You may have noticed the shelves of supermarkets recently have been quite empty in places. A lot of that is down to climate impacts in other parts of the world. And it is having huge knock-on impacts in terms of prices. Coffee is really, really threatened. Olives, etc. Anything you could name, there will be different impacts there. And the end result of that is whether it's available in the shop. So, that resilience, that local resilience on food is really, really important there. Climate-related failure of the power system, risks to human health, well-being, and multiple risks to the UK from climate change impacts overseas. So those are the sort of top 8 risks. And, it's down to government to really respond to that. And they have almost singularly ignored the Committee on Climate Change for quite a long time. And there are other slides I'm having sort of training where you look at government policies and you look at areas around transport or around energy, and you look at what the policy, how good the policy is, where that is, and how good and where the delivery is on that. And it's pretty shocking across the board. There are some good things, but generally it's quite shocking. When you get into this territory, when you reach these tipping points, all the bets are off because there is no science there. We don't really know. You can say this is what happens with a temperature rise of 2.4. You can say these the kind of carbon. We have carbon budgets in this country, so we have every to get to 5-year chunks. There are these targets, and we've actually been pretty good to date on that. It's going forward that is the difficult one. But when you get into these tipping points, that's where we do not know what will happen, and that's where you can end up with runaway climate change. So, for instance, you might get, I don't know if anybody's ever seen these before, but these methane craters, they can suddenly, where methane will just erupt like that from underneath the permafrost, and it will just cause this perfect cylindrical explosion. And that can just happen really suddenly. It happens in the ocean, and it's the likelihood of that increases. Global dimming is weirdly, it's one of these things that we actually used to talk about quite a while ago, and didn't get talked about for years, and it's just started to come back on the agenda again. And that is where actually pollution, smog, etc., has a mitigating effect on carbon emissions and on temperatures. So it actually sort of masks the true impact of climate change. So if ironically, if you've got a city that has been that has had a lot of poor air quality and smog, and then suddenly it cleans up its act, then the temperature suddenly sort of goes up quite a lot, and that with, I suppose, India, China might be that sort of place where you can mention that, where all of a sudden when you're bringing in renewables and stuff, there will be this sort of lag where potentially carbon emissions, the temperature rise could really go up. Ocean acidification, if you've ever heard of that, that's where the actual pH of the ocean starts to change, and that will have sort of big impacts on sort of food systems. And obviously krill is one of the most important things in the ocean. If krill goes, then lots of food chains collapse.
And it sequesters carbon.
And
Krill sequesters carbon.
Exactly. And there's also along those lines, the ocean obviously sequesters a lot of carbon, as do soils. When you can get to a certain point, if you get to that point where rather than actually sequestering carbon, they start releasing carbon, that's why peat is so important, because peat is one of our best carbon sequestering habitats, but so much of it has been removed and degraded. But if it gets to that point where suddenly it's producing greenhouse gases, when the sinks become emitters, that's really scary. And then this is another one. This is the albedo effect. So as the temperature increases and the white that reflects the sunlight and reduces temperatures, darker surfaces appear, and the rate of temperature rise, heating actually increases. So when that gets to a point, that can suddenly increase. And also this is permafrost melt as well. So, you start to have, I don't know if you ever heard of drunken forests. So that's happened quite a lot in those permafrost areas. So bits of Russia and other areas where the permafrost melts and just whole landscapes disappear, buildings disappear. And you get these kind of like slightly skewed buildings and weird trees and drunken forests, they're called. So just very quickly, decarbonising the energy mix. To date, we have done quite well. And the main reason for that has been around coal, about the reduction in coal use meeting electricity demand. And we're actually, we've eliminated our coal use, which is quite amazing. Other parts of the world have not done that, and actually in some parts of the world it's increasing. So I suppose there's two things there. One is that you can't rely on those reductions anymore to meet our carbon reduction targets. It's not going to come from removing coal. It is going to come from, and you can see here, the increase in the use of wind and solar. Even nuclear is being talked about. Carbon capture technology, which you may have heard, that's been back on the menu for a while. That has been talked about for God knows how many years, and the millions that has been spent on that, and it's never, ever, ever happened at any kind of commercial scale. That is just, for me, that is a distraction. Really, you could be using that money for just far more renewables. I can see John disagrees, but it's just, the carbon capture demonstration fund 2003, it was a big government initiative, and it just hasn't happened. It's not just about coal use and electricity, it's about energy efficiency, it's about renewable energy, it's about transport. Flying and shipping are the big ones. Obviously, third runway at Heathrow doesn't necessarily fit into that equation very well, and there's lots of things around sort of fuel additives being a big hope, with shipping potentially sort of electricity power for when they move into port, and hydrogen for when they're out of port. There's the refrigeration of all of our goods, food, agriculture, waste, consumption, you name it. I suppose the point here is that we have to start thinking about things in a different way, which is why I love the concept of regenerative agriculture and regenerative design, which is, in terms of agriculture, it's sort of understanding what your particular operation is. It's thinking about the soil, bearing in mind all the carbon and the resilience, being resilient, maximising your crop diversity, keeping the soil covered so it doesn't dry out in the sun, so it doesn't flood, it slows the flow. And integrating your livestock. My favourite, I call these panda cows, but I think they're belted Galloway. There's a great film called 6 Inches of Soil, I think. Is that right? But there was, and it looked at a load of sort of 4 case studies, sort of landowners, small holdings. And this, I think, was in Bodmin Moor. He had a farm there. And they all found it really, really tough. It was really tough going, apart from this one where they really employed all those regenerative approaches. They graze under trees. I mean, obviously from a climate perspective, it's probably better not to eat meat. But I think if you're going to eat meat, and if you're going to think about the sort of regenerative side of it and the landscape, then that's the way to go. And then, in terms of being resilient, we've mentioned in the buildings, we have to think about things differently. This building, for instance, it's a really important building in Lewes, beautiful. It's the heating system in here is unbelievable. I've been in the boiler room. It is literally like going into hell. It's just this inferno. We don't seem to be able to get it right. There's not much. We did spend quite a long time with sorting these windows out with these internal things, but internal glazing. But there are lots of things you can't do, and a lot of that is to do with conservation. Those are issues we're going to have to tackle. As it kicks in. Obviously, food production is a big one. You know, just the behaviour change. If you go to the south of France and it's 40 degrees regularly there, people don't go out and play tennis at 12 o'clock and midday. You know, it's like lifestyles change and you have shutters on your window. We used to jokingly talk about painting roofs white and reducing the temperatures, but it is done elsewhere. You know, it works. Trees, more trees, you know, reduces the temperature. You know, it increases resilience. And this is one I feel, you know, very connected to, the Cockshoot Restoration Project, and it's part of a sort of a bigger thing around sort of wild rose, and it came from the Sussex Flow Initiative, and that's all about slowing the flow of the water. You know, the Lewes brooks, and you know, even up to around Lewes, you know, it used to be flooded for, you know, a couple of months a year. You know, the sea used to come in that far. You know, so the landscape is there to act close, and I think we've kind of lost a lot of that connection. You know, when we're talking about buildings, you know, and we understand, you know, the pressures of house building and populations, but if we're dealing with those increasing climate impacts, we have to think about where are you going to hold water. You know, how are you going to cool these places down? And sometimes that means not building on a floodplain. So just very quickly, I just think it's important to sort of think about why we don't act, because we know all this stuff and this is nothing new, and yet nothing happens. Part of it is because it's what's known as a wicked problem. It's not a tame problem. There are so many parts to this. It's quite difficult to get to grips with sometimes, which is why I think it's important to keep it quite local and personal and do what you can do. I think our brains, you know, sometimes, you know, our perception of risk is sort of shaped by, you know, that kind of scientific response. And yet, you know, when you react to something emotionally, like Valencia, for instance, which I know I did, and I thought, everything's going to change now. It's got close. People forget about it, you know, and the effect sort of wears off. Confirmation bias, you know, it's something we see on social media all the time. We just, you know, those algorithms, they just tell you what they think they think you want to know. So for me, it's bicycles, and I just think I don't want to know any more about bicycles. But it's just, you know, you get told about stuff, and it's also that sort of when we're talking about 2050. 2080, end of the century, this is what the temperature is going to be by the end of the century. It seems a long way off, and it's like, well, you know, we can take our time, we can plan, but somehow you've got to keep that urgency there. So I think how you reconcile the two, and I think a lot of this stuff does force you to self-reflect. And you know, I do remember this with we used to do a thing with ecological footprinting. And you know, some environmental groups, their footprint would suddenly come out quite high, and they say, "What? But I buy my food at the farmers market. I have renewables to do all this thing." Yes, but you fly once a year. You know, you do. So there is, you know, this is not about judgment, but it's about sort of making those choices, and sort of it's quite difficult. And I think the last thing I just wanted to put there was around rights of nature, because something was sort of very involved in with sort of Lewes. And the reason why that is so important is because it's about the sort of the interdependencies and the reconnection with nature, and thinking that actually we're not apart, we don't stand apart, we are part of. And I think until we realise that, then we're not actually going to be equipped to sort of adequately deal with it. It's about, you know, about living within planetary bounds. So just to mention, if you're interested in any climate resilience training, which is free at the moment, we're funded for East Sussex, then let me know. We can work with you know, community groups, individuals, companies, schools, whatever, and we can do them in a variety of different ways. But you also get accredited by the Carbon Literacy Framework, so that's quite good. We've got some climate risk assessments workshops coming up. So there'll be one at the end of March. There's 2 workshops. And we're looking to work with, for instance, Friends of Lewes, Climate Hub, so this is Lewes District Council, Railway Land Trust, Lewes Football Club. So some of these organisations from different areas around town, we've developed a climate risk template so you can see how your buildings or your operations, what you do, will be impacted by climate change and how you respond to that. Are you prepared? We won't get back to some weird halcyon sort of days. Probably the most important thing to do is you do your carbon footprint. And that will just guide you. The WWF have quite a nice one that compares. And then you can work out what are those areas that you can really tackle. Because some areas you might actually have to make that choice that I can't do much about that. And that's kind of fine. It's about sort of tackling those areas that you can do something about.